Montana Territory, 1883. The first scream came just after midnight, sharp enough to cut through the storm winds rolling off the Bitterroot Range. Tessa Kincaid's voice echoed through the empty saloon, muffled by the thick wood walls of the locked storage room they were using as a makeshift cell. She kicked once more at the door, then slumped back against the crates of tobacco and whiskey behind her, her wrists raw from the rope. "No one's coming," she whispered to herself. Outside, thunder rumbled low and slow, crawling across the sky like a warning. The men who had tied her up and thrown her in here were long gone, riding out before the law came sniffing around. They had not expected her to fight back. She had not expected to survive. But she had. Now she just had to survive the dark. The rope bit into her palms again as she shifted, her breath catching in her throat. The lantern they had left behind had long since burned out. Her dress was torn, her knees scraped from being dragged across the floor. But her eyes were clear. She was not broken. Not yet. Footsteps creaked across the saloon floor above. She froze. A moment passed. Then another. She heard it again, softer this time, like someone trying not to be heard. "Hello?" she tried, voice hoarse. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped. She pressed her ear to the door. Silence. Then, the faintest whisper. "You in there?" Her breath hitched. "Yes." A pause. Then the sound of a key turning slowly in the lock. The door creaked open, just enough for a sliver of lantern light to spill into the dark. And in that light stood a man she had seen only once or twice around town, a ranch hand, quiet, always with his hat low and shoulders hunched like he was trying to disappear. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. I saw them bring you in. I waited until they left," he said, voice barely louder than the wind outside. "Are you hurt?" She blinked at him, struggling to place his name. He was young, maybe 26 or 27, with dark hair that curled lightly around his collar. His coat was soaked from the rain, and he looked like he wanted to bolt as soon as he had stepped in. "I am fine," she said, though her hands were still tied behind her back. "Just get me out of these ropes." He fumbled with a knife from his belt, stepping close enough for her to smell rain and saddle leather. His hands shook as he cut through the bindings. "You got a name?" she asked, watching him. He nodded, eyes fixed on the rope. "Orren. Orren Jameson." "Tessa Kincaid," she said. "You saved me." He looked up, startled. "I know, I did not want to leave you in here." "Well, I am glad you did not." She stood slowly, legs stiff. Orren caught her elbow to steady her. His touch was light, respectful. He looked at her like she was something fragile, but not weak. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "No," she said, then added, "not for lack of trying." They stood there for a beat, the storm still hissing outside the walls. "You should not be here," she said. "They might come back." He swallowed. "I do not care." She studied him. Orren had the look of a man who had spent most of his life watching from a distance. His eyes were soft, but not empty. She had seen men with eyes like that before, men who had loved and lost and learned to carry it quiet. "Come on," he said. "We have to get you out of town before morning." "Where will we go?" "There is an old line shack up near Flathead Creek. My boss's land. No one checks at this time of year." She hesitated, but then nodded. "All right." Orren led her out the back of the saloon, where his horse and aging dun mare stood tethered under a lean-to. He helped her up, then swung into the saddle behind her, arms braced around her without touching her more than he had to. They rode for miles in silence, the only sounds the rain and the rhythm of hooves on wet earth. Tessa leaned back just slightly into him, letting the warmth of his coat seep into her spine. By the time they reached the shack, her hair was plastered to her face, and her teeth chattered. Orren helped her down, got a fire going, and handed her a blanket from a chest in the corner. "You will be safe here," he said, hanging his hat on a nail. She wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, staring at the fire. "Why did you come for me, Orren?" He looked down at his boots. "Because I knew no one else would." She shifted to face him. "You do not even know me." "I have seen you at the general store," he said. "Once you helped old Mrs. Tally lift a sack of flour. You smiled at her like she mattered." Tessa did not speak for a long moment. Thank you, she said finally. He nodded, then took the extra blanket and laid it out on the floor near the hearth. You take the cot, she said. I will be fine here. She hesitated, then stepped closer. I do not want to be alone tonight. Orren looked up at her, startled. She reached out and touched his hand. His fingers curled, not away from her but around hers. I will stay right here, he said quietly. Tessa sat down beside him. The firelight danced across his face, and in that moment something in her eased. Orren did not press her. He did not ask questions. He just sat with her while the storm passed outside and the wind settled into a hush. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not move away. And for the first time in days, Tessa felt like she could breathe again. By dawn, the wind had thinned to a breeze and the shack's corners no longer creaked with each gust. The fire had burned low, leaving a soft bed of coals that cast a dull red glow across the floorboards. Tessa stirred on the cot, blinking against the weak morning light filtering through the warped slats above the window. Orren was already up. He'd pulled on his coat and was tending to something outside. The door left slightly ajar. She could hear the quiet scrape of metal and the occasional stamp of the mare's hooves. She sat up, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her body ached in odd places, but she was steady. She found her boots by the hearth, still damp but not soaked through. As she laced them, the smell of damp pine drifted in, fresh and sharp. When Orren came back in, his hands were smudged with dirt and a thin cut curved across one knuckle. He glanced at her, then quickly away as though unsure what to say now that the silence of the night had passed. I buried the lantern from the saloon, he said. Didn't want anyone finding it if they came looking? Tessa nodded, pushing her hair back from her face. You think they'll try? Not today, he said. But they'll notice you're gone. She stood and crossed to the small table, brushing a layer of dust from its surface with her sleeve. I need to get out of the territory. North, maybe? Plenty of logging camps up that way. I can work. He leaned his shoulder against the doorframe, arms crossed. You shouldn't go alone. Too many men think a woman on the road means she's theirs to handle. I've been handling myself a long time, she said, not with pride, but with fact. I know. He hesitated, then added, but it doesn't have to stay that way. She looked at him fully then, and for once he didn't drop his gaze. His eyes were darker in the morning light, the green of them dulled by shadows under his brow. You offering to come along? She asked. No, he said. I'm offering to take you. Safe. As far as you need. She studied him, the way his jaw tensed like he was waiting for her to laugh or refuse. Instead, she stepped closer. Why does it matter to you? She asked. You don't know me. Not really. I don't need to, he said. That night in the saloon, they tied you up like you weren't even a person, and you still stood straighter than most men I've met. The words sat between them, unsaid things clinging to the quiet. She didn't thank him. Not again. Instead, she said, there's a station at Whitefish. If I had coin, I could buy a seat on the freight cart up to Kalispell. He nodded. Freight don't run for 4 days. I can get you there before then. Her shoulders dropped. A breath she hadn't realized she was holding easing from her chest. All right. They packed what little the shack offered: dried beans, a tin of lard, a half-empty box of cartridges. Orren rolled the extra blanket and tied it behind the saddle. They rode out before the sun had fully cleared the trees, heading northwest through the thickening pine, the trail soft with last night's rain. They didn't speak much that first day. The silence wasn't heavy, just full. Tessa watched the way Orren moved in the saddle, quiet, measured, as though he'd learned to take up as little space as possible. When they stopped at a creek to water the horse, she asked, You always keep to yourself like this? He shrugged, crouching to refill the canteen. Talking's never done much for me. Folks don't hear me right. She crouched beside him. You mean they don't listen? That too. She dipped her fingers in the cold water, then splashed her face. You ever been north before? Once. Drove cattle up toward Libby with my uncle when I was 16. Got snowed in for 2 weeks. Thought we'd die. What changed? He handed her the canteen. Uncle fell through the ice. I pulled him out. She blinked. You were just a kid. So was he in some ways. They rode again until the trees thinned and the land opened into a narrow valley where they made camp beneath a rocky overhang. Orren built the fire while she gathered dry pine needles to lay beneath their blankets. That night, they ate cold beans and shared the last heel of cornbread she'd had in her pocket since the saloon stale, but better than nothing. As she stretched out near the fire, she watched him add a log and settle back on his haunches. "You miss anyone?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. "Then, my sister. She died 2 winters ago. Fever took her before the doctor even got to the house." Tessa nodded, the flames dancing in her eyes. "I lost my father to a mining collapse in Utah, just after I turned 17. Hard to hold onto people in these parts. Harder to let go." Neither of them spoke after that. When she laid down, she felt the warmth of him at her back, not close enough to touch, but close enough to know she wasn't alone. And for the first time in years, she didn't dream of falling. The third morning on the trail dawned with frost crusting the edges of the pines, and a pale sun rising behind a veil of high mist. Orren had already saddled the mare and packed what little they still carried. Tessa watched him from where she crouched near the coals, fingers stretched toward the heat. "You always start the day like you're half expecting trouble," she said. He adjusted the cinch without looking up. "It's easier to be surprised by quiet than by gunfire." She stood, brushing pine needles from her skirt. "That how your uncle taught you?" "No," he said. "That I learned myself." They took the ridge trail, higher and slower, but less likely to cross paths with anyone traveling up from the towns. As they rode, the trees grew taller, older, draped in moss and heavy with the stillness that came when the world hadn't been disturbed in days. Around midday, the trail narrowed to a rocky ledge. Orren dismounted and led the horse by the reins, one hand steady on her neck while Tessa walked behind, boots scraping stone. She said, "You ever think about owning land?" He didn't answer right away. The wind tugged at the hem of his coat and the mare flicked her ears at a gust. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but I never thought I'd stay anywhere long enough." She narrowed her eyes against the brightness of the clouds. "You're not the drifting kind, Orren. You don't know that. I've seen how you look after things. You tie every knot like you expect it to hold for years." He glanced back at her, then looked away. "That's not the same as belonging." They reached the top of the ridge by late afternoon. Below them, the valley sloped northward toward the river. Tessa stepped ahead, looking out over the trees. The sunlight caught the tips of the firs like gold dust, and a hawk circled far off, gliding on the thermals. "Used to be I'd look at that," she said, "and it'd just feel like distance. Like no matter how far I went, I'd still be running from something." He came to stand beside her. "And now?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned to him, her brow furrowed. "Why'd you stay in that town so long?" she asked. "You don't seem like someone who needs the company." He shifted his weight, eyes on the horizon. It was quiet. No one asked much. "I could get by just being useful. Getting by isn't the same as living." "No," he said, "but sometimes it's the only thing that keeps a man from sinking." She watched him for a long moment. Then, "You ever want more than that?" He met her gaze. "I did once. Thought I'd marry a girl down near Miles City. She had a laugh that made me forget what day it was." "What happened?" "She married someone else. A man with a proper house and good boots." Tessa tilted her head. "You still think you weren't enough?" "I knew I wasn't." She didn't argue. Instead, she said, "Then you've been carrying that all this time." He looked down. "Some things settle in the bones." They made camp early that night on a flat patch of ground above the river. Orren caught a brace of grouse with a wire snare he'd tucked in his bag, and Tessa cleaned them while he set stones around the fire. They ate with their fingers, grease hot on their skin, the meat sweet and gamey. Afterward, she sat cross-legged on the bedroll holding the tin cup he'd filled with warm creek water. "I used to think if I ever got out of that town, I'd never trust anyone again," she said. "What changed?" "You," she said. "You didn't ask anything from me. You just opened the door." He didn't speak, but his jaw shifted like he was working something out inside himself. She watched the firelight dance in his eyes. "You ever think about what comes after this?" He rubbed his palms together, voice low. "I think about building a place with real windows. A stove that doesn't smoke. Maybe a garden." Not much, just enough. Sounds like more than getting by. He looked at her then, really looked, and something passed between them, quiet as a breath, sure as a promise. If I built it, he said, would you come see it? She didn't smile. She didn't need to. Only if there's a porch, she said. And room for 2 chairs. There would be. That night, when they lay down, she turned toward him. He didn't reach for her, but he didn't pull away when she edged closer. Her hand found his beneath the blanket, and his fingers closed around hers, steady and warm. Neither of them spoke again. But in the hush of the pines and the soft crackle of coals, they began to believe in something neither of them had dared name before. They reached Whitefish late on the 5th day, dusted in road grit and quiet from the steadiness of travel. The town sat low against the foot of the hills, steam rising from chimneys like breath in the cold spring air. With smoke and the distant clang of a smith's hammer drifted on the breeze as they rode in slow, the mare's pace easy with tired legs. Orren led her past the freight yard, the rutted streets slick with meltwater. Wagons rattled over the slush, and a boy ran past with a bundle of kindling in his arms. Tessa kept her eyes forward, her hat low over her brow. She didn't look at the storefronts or the faces glancing up from porches. At the edge of town, he tethered the mare near a half-built barn, then nodded for her to follow. They stepped into a narrow alley beside a dry goods shop, where the walls blocked the wind and the noise. You'll want to book passage early, he said. They fill up fast once word spreads of work upriver. I know, she said, folding her arms, but I'm not going. He blinked. You said I changed my mind. Her voice was steady, but her jaw worked like she was still arranging the words. There's a woman here, Mrs. Renner. She used to run a boarding house in Helena. Came north last year with her husband. I heard she's looking for help, someone who can sew, keep books, mind the front. That's work I can do. Orren nodded slowly. You sure? I don't want to keep running, she said. I want a door that stays closed behind me. A room that's mine. He leaned back against the wall, arms crossed lightly. You'll be good at it. I'll be better if I'm not alone. He looked at her then, long and even. I was going to ride back south. Thought maybe I'd stretch my pay out, take winter work in the lower valley. She took a half step toward him. You don't have to. I know. A wagon rumbled past the mouth of the alley, its wheels grinding over gravel. The moment stretched, neither of them moving, as if the world had narrowed to the space between their boots. You want to see the house built? She asked. With the porch and the real windows? I do. Then don't build it for someday, she said. Build it now. Build it here. His throat worked, but he didn't speak. She reached for his hand, her fingers threading through his like they belonged there. I'm not asking for promises carved in stone, Orren. Just a place to stand. Beside you. He closed his fingers around hers, his palm rough but sure. You'd have it, he said. Every day I could give. She smiled, not wide, not showy, just a soft thing that settled in her cheeks and stayed there. Then let's see about that job. They walked back into town together, hand in hand, the streets still bustling but no longer strange. When they passed the smithy, the farrier called out a greeting, and Orren tipped his hat without letting go of her. The little white house on the hill above the stables had a crooked fence and a roof patched with tin. But the porch was wide and the land behind it sloped gently toward the trees. They bought it that summer, with what she earned at the boarding house and what he saved from hauling lumber for the mill. They painted it before the frost came. She chose pale yellow. He built the porch himself. 2 chairs sat out front by the end of October. Neither of them ever left. By early May, the ground had softened enough for planting. Each day, Tessa rose before the sun, tying her hair back with a strip of muslin and pulling on her apron before the first light touched the hills. The boarding house work was steady, but her hours had shortened through spring, and she'd taken to spending her afternoons out on the parcel of land behind the house, turning the soil with a borrowed hoe and a tin pail of seed packets tucked beneath one arm. Orren came down from the ridge road most evenings, boots dusted and shoulders lined with the day's labor. He'd started hauling timber for a crew cutting a path through the North Pass. It paid better than ranch handwork, and there was talk of a rail spur reaching Whitefish before winter. He never said much about the men he worked with, but Tessa could tell by the way he stepped through the door, quiet and worn, but not hunched, that he was holding steady. One evening as he washed up at the pump behind the house, she leaned against the porch rail, a handful of seeds still in her palm. "You ever think you'd end up with a garden?" she asked. He let the water run over his hands, then shook them dry. "Didn't think I'd end up with a house?" She tipped the seeds back into the paper envelope. "I'm thinking of putting in onions. Mrs. Renner says they keep longer than most everything, and they don't mind the cold." He dried his face on his sleeve and stepped up onto the porch beside her. "Seems smart." She handed the seed packet to him. "You want to help me plant them?" He glanced at the packet, then at her. "I never planted anything that didn't have hooves and a tail." "Well," she said, "now you will." They worked side by side until the light faded, knees damp with earth and fingers caked in soil. Tessa pressed each bulb into the furrow while Orren followed behind, covering them with the heel of his hand. The silence between them was easy, filled with the small movements of shared effort. As the last row was covered, she wiped her hands on her apron and sat back on her heels. "You ever miss the road?" she asked. He looked out toward the tree line, where the sun was bleeding orange across the sky. "I don't think I ever liked it enough to miss it." She tilted her head, studying him. "What do you like?" He turned to her slowly, eyes steady. "I like the way your voice sounds when you're thinking hard. I like that you planned in straight rows. I like coming home and knowing you'll be here." She didn't look away. "I like you," he said. Tessa reached for his hand, their fingers meeting over the last furrow of soil. "Then stay." "I already did." They walked back to the house with their hands still clasped, the scent of pine smoke curling from the chimney. Later that summer, Orren carved a name into the beam above the porch step. Kincaid Jameson. The letters were deep and even, the kind of work done slow and meant to last. He'd made the ring himself from a twist of old silver, and she wore it on a leather cord around her neck until he could afford a band that fit her hand just right. By the time the frost came again, the garden had yielded more than they'd expected. Onions, yes, but also thick red potatoes, string beans, and 4 squat pumpkins that sat in a row beside the door. She'd sewn curtains from flour sackcloth and hung them in the front window. He'd repair the roof one shingle at a time. In the evenings, after supper, they sat on the porch with mugs of chicory and the lantern between them. Sometimes she'd read aloud from the paper, her voice soft and steady. Sometimes he'd whittle a length of pine, the shavings catching the lamplight like curled snow. No one came looking for her. Nothing pulled him away. They lived through the winter with enough wood stacked high and enough jars lined up in the pantry to make it through without hunger. When the snow pressed hard against the walls, they stayed curled together near the stove, talking in low voices about the land they'd tend come thaw, about the room they planned to build at the back of the house. They never spoke of what they'd lost, only what they had now. In spring, she planted again. He added a bench to the porch, and when they walked into town hand in hand, folks nodded and made room for them, like they'd been part of the place all along. They never left, and they never needed to.